Professor Curley, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, your research focuses on the everyday incorporation of indigenous nations into colonial economies. What are some examples of this?
Well, my initial research project as a graduate student, I think, was the main example that I had in mind at that time, although there's many other examples, but it was the coal economy in the Navajo Nation, which started in the 1960s, at least in an industrial scale, and has come to an end in many parts of the reservation over the last few years. And so it's thinking about the ramifications of that type of economy, that participation in extractive industries, in coal in particular, the kind of work and labor involved, the kind of revenues generated for the tribal government, and then, of course, the environmental consequences of that type of work. And those are the things that are part of the colonial economies that surround Indian country and incorporate large parts of our lands into the service of other things. So when we think about coal, a lot of the energy produced, in fact, all of the energy produced was going toward outside communities and going towards specific types of projects. In this case, with the Kayenta mine and the Navajo generating station, the coal was going toward, the energy produced by coal was going towards the Central Arizona Project, the making of this water infrastructure in Arizona. But other parts of the economy, the Navajo mine on the eastern end of the reservation, in what is part of New Mexico, that's going towards. I think even PNM has some utility stake in these power plants, so that's going towards the places where PNM serves. So all of this is to say the kinds of economic activities generated in the reservation and which were structured through a lot of long-term policies from the federal government, partnership with state officials, especially in the 1930s. These economies are geared toward outside interests, and especially other communities, settler communities outside of the reservation. So that's kind of my general idea of what colonial economies are.
I wanted to talk with you a little bit more about the Colorado River, which is basically, in crisis mode right now for cities and irrigation districts. There's more of a demand for water than there is a supply right now. You've written extensively about the Central Arizona Project, and I heard you speak recently about scarcity and how we don't talk enough about how dams and reservoirs are what you called the concrete manifestations of colonialist ambitions and how they contribute to drought and to this narrative of drought and narrative of crisis. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
When Boulder Canyon Act was passed, when the Hoover Dam was constructed, there's all this mythology and lore about the construction of these infrastructures, and then eventually Glen Canyon Dam, Parker Dam, the Central Arizona Project, all of these dams along the lower basin part of the Colorado River. These dams we weren't asking questions about, oh, this is too expensive, this is not serving enough people. It was all less future oriented ideology, like, oh, we need to create cap in order for Phoenix to grow. We need to build these dams in order for the Southwest to blossom. And the problem with, obviously there's a different standard being applied when you're talking about where you're talking about infrastructures that serve white communities as opposed to infrastructures that serve native communities. And you can guess what the reason is for those double standards. And and so when you're thinking about things like the Hoover Dam, when you're thinking about things like CAP, and you're thinking about the crisis we're in now and the drought and the effects of climate change on the Colorado River, you know, that's something like, when you introduced this question, you said the river is in crisis for X amount of people, water districts, these people, all of these people who have been benefiting from these colonial diversions for quite some time. And if you take it from an indigenous perspective, if you take it from a Navajo perspective, a Today perspective, or Hopi perspective, you're going to see that that river's been in crisis for quite some time, going back to these first incursions into the region, going back to the construction of the Roosevelt Dam along the Salt River. Once the colonialists came in and started to dam the river and change the ecology, that's when the river started to go into crisis. That's kind of the origin of climate change in the region. It did affect the climate, it affected the river, it affected the ecologies of the region. That's exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about climate change. So we can't divorce these infrastructures from the consideration of climate change. And so in the presentation, I show actually that's what we include these infrastructures when we're thinking about the effects of climate change. We look at reservoir levels and we say, oh, look, there's climate change here because the reservoirs are sinking. Well, those reservoirs are those colonial intrusions in the first place. They're not natural. They're not meant. The river was never meant to sit the way it does behind the walls of these dams. And so that itself is the origin of the problem beyond this larger question of declining snowpack or faster melting snowpack or prolonged drought in the region. I mean, those things are also important, but what we're not considering are the effects of these dams. That was kind of the point I was trying to make is like you look at even how we talk about climate change. We talk about the Colorado River and it being endangered. And it was like, and when the origin point of that endangerment begins in most people's mind is fairly recently, and it doesn't go back to the Colorado Compact. I feel arguably the Colorado Compact has had more impact on the Colorado River than the effects of climate change thus far. And so, why aren't we talking about that?
Yeah, and it's sort of talking about these myths and these different narratives. When we talk about climate change, kind of across the news media, and there's a lot of doom or talk about apocalypse, and you and many others point out that that's really a Eurocentric narrative around nature and around climate catastrophe. Um, what does that miss out on? What is that lacking? How could that be different? How is that different?
I'm not the first one to come up with this point. Many other indigenous scholars and environmental historians even have talked about how how the way we understand time and progress and future catastrophe, um, it is neglecting what is the experience of indigenous nations, what is the experience of people on the ground or people that are sucked up into these systems when worlds end. There are these world-ending experiences for people that have already happened, and so you're thinking about apocalypse, and your imagination is imagining the end of the world for a certain group of people. And usually they're suburban or affluent or, city people or politicians, or I don't know what is in the minds of people when they're talking about this apocalypse in the future or the danger of the rivers. But what ends up being neglected is kind of these past intrusions. And so when you're talking about the damming up of like the Missouri River, right, with the Pix-Sloan Acts and the flooding of hundreds of acres of indigenous land that was guaranteed through treaty, that is a world-changing experience. That is an apocalypse of sorts. And when you're talking about the building of these dams along the Navajo Nation and the land swaps involved in order to get a Lake Powell and to still maintain a land base in the Navajo Nation, these are apocalyptic scenarios, and often they happen with dams and with the way we treat water in the West. We've created these huge and world-changing infrastructures throughout the region that have also contributed to the changing of the landscape, the urban landscape. Even going through Phoenix or Albuquerque or Santa Fe over the last few years, you see cities growing and growing and growing, made possible by these infrastructures. So the worlds are always changing around us, and what is missed by this fear of what's happening at the end of the world due to climate change is really the kind of innovative, both social, political, and cultural strategies that indigenous people have had and have been made to have in order to survive across all of these apocalyptic events. You know, we've dealt with all sorts of all sorts of worst case scenarios. You know, even being moved physically off of our land at the end of a bayonet to in Huelde, you know, into Bosque Redondo on the eastern end of New Mexico. That's between 1862 and 1868. You know, that is an apocalypse moment for us, and we survived that, and we overcame that, and we made a new world in the Navajo Nation after that. And so there's a lot to learn from indigenous peoples' ability to respond to these catastrophes and to think about what are the values of a society that has had to overcome all these marginalizations and yet continue to survive, and what is and compare that to the values of a society that are causing those problems, that are causing these catastrophes to occur in the first place. And then maybe rather than thinking about technical solutions, we think of political and ethical solutions, right? We think about how we treat the planet ethically first before we think about things technically. And I think that gears us in a totally different direction than if we continue to have this modernist and Eurocentric idea of time, of progress and technical innovation. And we have crisis, and the solution to those crises is more technology, improved technology. When we're thinking along those lines, we end up um, not only creating more problems because you have to create new kinds of industries to serve these new ones, we perpetuate existing inequalities. When we're valuing technological innovation over what are our over social directionality and what are the values of the society, then we're not looking at other kinds of solutions. How do we work on social, political, and economic inequalities at the same time while we're dealing with things that are seen to be in the realm of the environmental crises? And I think that is kind of the larger, more, I guess, philosophical question that we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about these ideas of apocalypse. So I'm sorry, that's a really long-winded answer, and it feels like it's leaving with this kind of vague idea of what to do in people's minds. But that's basically where I'm at with how we were thinking about these things. So, me and other people who have been writing about this.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Professor Curley. I really appreciate it.
Yes, you're welcome.